ego mind and the conscious mind are two different organs. I think people still, they don't really hear that.
Yeah.
They just,
like, oh, that's like ego mind 2.0. It's like, no.
Yeah, exactly. It comes back to the thing where it's like, okay, well, how do I shift from my ego to my conscious?
Well, what was that we'll get to that, right? I mean, that's like that's it, but that's not, you can't. Anyway, what was that realization like for you? Like, what was the emotion around it? What was the experience of it? What kind of triggered it, or what kind of things were going on when that happened?
I mean, I think it's the stuff I've mentioned in that first season of the podcast, where I'd say that the first one that jumps out at me is when I was in college and I felt like I was just spiraling towards insanity, hopelessness, despair.
The big three.
Yeah. And I was frantically trying to grasp intellectually the big questions, right? It's like, I've got to find the answer to this list of questions that is the list that humanity's been trying to grasp.
Right.
All along. And
why would I be here if not to figure that out?
Yeah. And a shift happened, as I've mentioned before. It's like there was this shift where I was reading a Zen Buddhism book, and I hadn't been practicing Zen meditation or anything. I just was reading, some Zen stuff, a handful of different Zen books. And I've gone back and looked at the particular passage when it happened, and I can't find anything in the particular passage but something happened, the stars aligned or something. And boom, I suddenly became conscious of a space, a territory, a lens, a sense of self that was outside of the puzzle that I thought I was trapped inside of. And it was like, wait a second, the cage that I was trapped in trying to get out of, I suddenly was outside looking at the cage going, wait a second, I'm already outside of that cage. Like that cage is inside of me, which was a huge shift.
Yeah.
It was a huge shift. And then right around the same time, it was afterwards, but I was watching Twin Peaks, that original Twin Peaks series, and there's a certain point where there's like this chess game thing going on, and the FBI agent says, or the sheriff says to the FBI agent, for people who know Twin Peaks, they're trying to figure out the bad guy's next chess move, right? Because the bad guy's giving these chess clues, and they're playing this game. Anyway, the sheriff says to the FBI agent, something about, what do you think, the next move's going to be? And Cooper, the FBI agent, says, I'm starting to focus out beyond the edges of the board. And it like threw me into this altered state. It was like someone just mainlined some kind of psychedelic into my system. It just, I got thrown into outer space for a minute.
Just for a minute? I mean, how long?
Well, for a while.
Okay. Yeah.
Ever since, really. Ever since. I've never been able to focus just on the board since.
Yeah.
No matter what the thing is, I'm always looking out beyond the edges of the board. It just like as a default.
Yeah.
It just happens now.
Thanks, Twin Peaks.
Yeah. Yeah.
That world of metaphor, I feel like, is a big part of it. That those kind of like getting thrown for a loop bits when you slip into being overpowered by metaphor, which may not be exactly what you're talking about, but it's what kind of resonates with me, that like when you can go too far beyond the edge of the board for sure.
Yeah.
And then everything is like a metaphor that's kind of evolving around you constantly. And part of it can be like hypersensitivity, but that switch you're talking about, I think probably happens for people, and it is a sign of like a shift in perspective and a shift of awareness to see beyond what your existing paradigm is, like you're saying.
Yeah.
That the words in the book don't necessarily matter. That your context gets overwritten or, kind of shaken up. And then you kind of step into a different lens, again, like you said.
As far as what does it mean to integrate that, if you use that word, right? Because now are you just kind of walking around high as a kite, for the rest of your life? Are you walking around sort of dissociated or depersonalized or spiritually bypassing, et cetera? Or what does it mean to bring it back and to integrate it into the 3D linear space-time mind and to integrate it into the physical body in a grounded to the earth way? Because that seems like a good thing to try to do, right? I mean, I don't know. You certainly have these different models out there that in some models, the goal is just to get the hell out of here. And so you want to just like go as high as you can and try to transcend or ascend, and not have to come back. And so any kind of grounding or healing or integrating is actually just further ego stuff that's in your way. And that's not what I'm working on. I'm working on trying to ground it, trying to heal, trying to be functional and embody the higher, in 3D linear space-time.
Yeah.
But so if that is the goal, if you decide that's the goal, it's like, okay, then what does that mean? What's in the way of that, right? Why is that hard to do? What is it that makes it so that, why when you take 5 big bong hits, is it hard to stay clear and grounded, right? How come you can't experience that high and that expansiveness and simultaneously be very clear and very grounded? What's going on there?
Yeah.
And obviously you could describe that in a lot of different ways, but if you're going to talk sort of the psychology of it, the ego mind's way of orienting, anchoring, and identifying is what comes into play, right? That's what gets disrupted. So your stability, and when I say stability, I don't mean trueness or realness or objectively accurate. I mean your ego stability, however diluted, however narcissistic, however, defended your ego might be.
Whatever you got.
Yeah, whatever you've got, 5 big bong hits is going to throw that off. Taking a bunch of acid's going to throw that off. Traumatic experience is going to throw that off. Someone coming at you with too much love is going to throw that off. Someone coming at you with too much hate, meaning too much for you, is going to throw that off. And so that's the game, right? We're all walking around where the real game or the sort of the primary game for any person is like, can they maintain their sanity? Can they maintain their bearings? Can they maintain their sense of self? That seems to be the primary thing, because if you can undo that in someone, right, then you render them dysfunctional. And obviously everything from mind control cults to just your basic marketing campaign aims at influencing a person on that level. But so I think it's really important to sort of see that and understand that, so that you can see that from the outside and have a knowing that that's what's going on in you. You're not seeing it 100% from some kind of clear, objective way. We're all caught in our own ego perspective to varying degrees. And then it's how do we let that ego perspective, how do we let that part of our mind change, adapt, grow, heal, which means a constant changing of sense of self, a constant changing of sense of other, a constant changing of sense of reality, a constant changing of what is real, what is true. That's in flux.
But it's like, it's how you allowing it to change is what keeps it grounded. I mean, if you just try to ascend and move past all of these things that are there, it's because you don't want that thing that was there to change. So you want to leave it as it was.
Yeah, right. Right.
Leave that understanding behind and just assume a new identity. Right? Which is, as we've talked about, just another way of playing the ego's game.
Yeah.
That if you can say that, so I mean, to me personally, like what you're talking about, as far as, ascend or transcend and not include, not integrate, is like escapism in one sense. It's living just out of this world instead of in this world, but not of it. And it's what I hear in people's understanding of sometimes that there's a tendency to just seek union, just seek a feeling of oneness of all things, at the expense of separateness. And I think what we talked about last time, which I think is true, and what I've kind of learned doing this work with you, is that acknowledging, accepting, and realizing separateness opens the door to actually relating. And it's because of that constantly shifting sense of self that you're talking about, and sense of other, because the dynamics, the complex dynamics of that become more and more apparent and clear the more you can disidentify with your previous self or selves or perspectives.
Right.
And so it's one paradigm shift that I've noticed in what you're talking about and what I've experienced, is that the relational model that you're teaching requires being separate.
It requires recognizing the ego's separateness.
But I'm saying it, I think if that gets too nuanced, I think like as far as like beginning to realize how real it is like accepting how separate you are. And it is ego. You're right. It's not, consciousness isn't separate, but we're so enmeshed with ego identity that you might as well say, you got to realize you're separate. Like there's like levels of truth, and there's some levels of truth that just obscure the intention. And what I'm trying to say is like, you have to see you're separate and like experience that. And because when I was asking about the kind of what was going on for you, and you kind of really were able to see that difference between ego mind and conscious mind, or some space or territory outside of your existing paradigm, to me, it was realizing a separateness that I didn't want to accept. Kind of gave me more access to those two different territories, and a better ability to differentiate between them.
And what was it that made you realize you were separate?
Well, there was a big shift there.
Just recently.
Yeah. It's been there all along. Like it's not, and this is where like the levels of meaning gets more, nuanced, and storytelling is harder to share, but I've had experiences of it, I think, with especially working with you and being able to differentiate it, but it took that other, it took that relational mirroring to experience it. And there's a way in which I've been better able to differentiate it for myself since that happened.
Yeah.
More readily accessible.
And that experience comes with, as you know, the state of thinking you're not separate on any particular level. To experience the separateness is, it's like splitting the atom. It's like there is a explosion that happens.
Yeah.
It's not just a bummer.
No, it's more intense than that.
Yeah, it's like the experience the mind has if some physical thing is happening and you're in the process of losing a limb, the primal explosive attempt to prevent it happens in a similar way in the psyche with regard to some kind of connection, fusion, merge, oneness you thought you could count on.
Right. But you realize it's not the oneness, it's not the true oneness, what you were relating to in that way.
Yeah, right.
Because that's still there. And again, like I know that that's true. Like it's not that that becomes untrue. You just realize that you hadn't really seen it yet.
Yeah.
What you thought was it was not it.
Yeah. It's really just your shoe being pulled off.
Yeah. But then once you start seeing that, like you just said, it's ever changing. That once one shoe comes off, other shoes start to come off, you know?
Yeah.
Lance is up in 7th right now.
I'm thinking about a second chakra separation experience I had recently where I just experienced rage and tried to, like, you know, have it be the other person's badness or fault, you know, that, and
when was it?
I mean, you know, this stuff, when you start tracking this stuff in this way, you notice it's like every day.
It's like the time is immaterial.
Yeah.
So.
But no, just the other day there was one where I felt it in an intense way, and it's like, all right, I know what's happening, but that only helps so much. And
I was only asking because I had one a couple weeks ago, and like it was the closest I felt to being manic in a long time.
Yeah, no, this was just a couple weeks ago.
So then I was like looking for a Twin Peaks moment, you know, like were we having the same experience in different times? And no, that's all. But it's can I ask a question about it? To me, I started to spin a narrative that was so absurd to justify how the split was the other person's fault.
Exactly. I did the same.
Yeah. Like to an insane degree. Like that's why I was saying I felt manic. Like it was like, and again, like you said, like I had enough awareness to like be like, this isn't something's going on. This isn't this isn't real, but it felt so real that I had to like, you know, check in with Sky and be like, so here's what I'm feeling. And then she was able to talk to me and be like, oh yeah, that's not what's going on. It was nuts.
Yeah, it brings to mind for me that thing where the more you become open to letting your mind run, it's like the more you look at what's actually moving in there, right? You become more and more aware. And again, back to Freud, this idea of free association, right? The more you allow free association, meaning if that's defined as letting your mind run and then consciously paying attention to what's running in my mind. Even when you're not triggered, the general idea is what's going to move is going to be nuts. Yeah. It's going to be nuts. Like that's a massive insight that humanity seems to have just kind of blocked out.
Because it's nuts.
Yeah, right. Your most sane, healthy, mature, functional adult, when they free associate, it's nuts. That's very important.
Not to mention 2 kooks on a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Or, you know, kooks that are triggered. Then it really gets nuts.
Yeah.
But being what I was going to say is, but when you're more aware of it, you actually register it, right? You start looking deeper and you can see deeper in, and so you become more conscious of what's deeper in, and this is the thing that Nietzsche's talking about and that Jung's talking about, where we guard against reality and we guard against our own true selves by not looking at what's underneath, right? We just look kind of surface layer, and so it goes through our filters, and then we're just looking at what comes out, you know, kind of at the end. Whereas if you start peeking underneath a certain filter and then underneath another filter and underneath, you start seeing a more and more dark, crazy set of content. And then it's horrifying because you start saying, oh my God, that's what I am. Right.
Right.
And of course the answer is no, that's not what you are. It's the workings of the human psyche. I'm just saying that because you bringing up that you were aware of this, narrative that was trying to be spun. And it's like, okay, is that evidence of what a maniac Jeff Blanton is? You know what I mean? Or is it evidence of how consciously, Jeff Blanton can watch the inner workings of his psyche? There's that kind of juxtaposition.
It was touch and go for us.
Yeah, right. And of course, in general, what matters most is behavior, right? It's like, all right, whether the key factor, at least in the moment, is what got behaved, because that's where there can be real dangerous, bad outcomes.
Totally, no ill behavior in this scenario.
Right.
I just think, like, to me, that separateness is like grounding when these things happen.
Yeah,
there's a tendency, again, that whole like narcissistic tendency to subsume other people into your own identity.
Right.
That when you create these narratives in reaction to these movements in your mind, you ascribe characteristics to the people around you because you make them part of this narrative. And if you don't hold separateness at the same time you hold a union, then you just like blast that around and just go through life creating that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you can remember that it still feels very real. It's in your mind. It's very overwhelming, whatever the content may be. And you're a separate self having this experience. It grounds you back into reality.
Yeah. And the way you put that right there is, I think, so important, that the narcissistic attempt to subsume others into your
identity,
your reality, your sense of self. And it's so tricky because that sounds so almost evil, but it's like, it's from this.
I mean, it could be,
it can be, but it's typically from this, it's like the motive is this like desire to be one with.
Yeah. I mean, it's self-preservation too, though.
Yeah, it's an unconscious thing, but in general, it's not, I'm going to go subsume that person.
Right.
It's more like, I'm going to go love that person. I'm going to go, do this wonderful, magical, awesome thing with that person.
Yeah.
It's typically not, I'm going to be a predator and hurt that person. Usually you're like, part of what goes on in the psyche is you can't believe the other person is rejecting you in this way, or is refusing to like be one with you in this way, because what you're bringing to the table is so awesome.
Right. Come on.
How could you not want to be one with this?
It's like, because you're your own person. Shit, foiled again.
Yeah. In a kind of in a similar vein here, I was working with a couple recently, and the
good segue.
But I was working with a couple where the husband is saying to the wife, you're just not the woman I married. Like, I can't believe the way you've changed, and the woman I like fell in love with and married, and you're just not her anymore. And then of course the wife is saying, that's right, I'm not. I've changed. But
it's a normal thing.
Yeah, and that's all normal. But what was sort of a deeper thing that went on here is then the wife said, she said, and on that note, she said, let's talk about what is wrong with you that you would marry that person that I was back then? Because I was like messed up. I had no sense of self. I was not mature enough. I was not in a place where I was able to be making good decisions and sort of had my own strong sense of autonomy and independence. And like, basically implying like, you're a monster for marrying that person that I was back then.
Right.
And of course, he's looking at me like, are you fucking kidding? You know, like, wait a second. How is this being
Thanks, Lance.
put on? Yeah. And it's like, well, you know, like she has a certain point.
Yeah.
But it's much more complicated than that, you know, but it's like that kind of happens, you know what I mean? That happens. I think it's common where, you know, these two people match up, and then over time there's this growth that happens, and the way that they had merged and experienced this oneness that felt so wonderful, it starts to come undone, which is growth. But it leaves them now, you know, in this experience of aloneness with each other. And just like a child with a parent, the person, one of the two people tends to feel like actually that oneness that we had, that the person was all about when it started, now they feel like that was abusive, you know, or that was controlling, or that was you, you know, having power over me. Right. And it's this very confusing thing, because it's easy to, you know, you can see how she's trying to demonize him.
Yeah, you want to externalize that fear of what was, or
yeah. And meanwhile, he's like, wait a second, what the hell? How, you know, not only is she like pulling away from me and like backing out, wanting to back out of our marriage, but now she's telling me I was somehow abusive for like wanting to like marry her and be with her. Right. You know, so you can feel for him. And it's this very confusing experience.
And like, yeah, there's a lot of reduction, you know, to a single characteristic going on.
Right.
And then, which is what we do when we're upset.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's intense.
And of course the question arises like, okay, what do you do? Where do you go from there? Right. And I think this applies not just to marriages, obviously, but all kinds of different socio-economic, political situations where you have a certain situation at a certain time, you know, a certain culture, a certain level of development, or a certain stage of evolution, and then it shifts. And now from the new perspective, you look back at the old one and then start saying who was abusive and who wasn't. And it's like, well, wait a second, right? It's more complicated than that. Like who was taking responsibility, who was taking charge, who was putting themselves at risk, who was, you know, out of a place of, because they were the ones that were capable or enabled at the time. But then down the road, it can look like that was unfair. It's like an older sibling telling the younger sibling what to do. It's like, well, there's an age where that's appropriate. And then at a certain age, the younger sibling is like, fuck you. Yeah. Why are you always telling me what to do? And it's like, well, because I've always had to tell you what to do, you know? And okay, fine, maybe you're getting to an age where I don't have to tell you what to do. But me telling you what to do kept you safe and helped you develop and helped you learn to get to where I'm at now. You know, and then the younger sibling is like not wanting to recognize that the older sibling was indeed superior in particular ways simply because the older sibling was older.
Yeah.
But then the younger sibling...
I feel like we're treading in dangerous territory without a specific example.
Yeah, I know. I'm specifically not giving an example. But, you know, the younger sibling gets to a certain age where it's like now the ways that the older sibling was superior, they're not anymore. Even just in size, right? It's like, you know, now the younger sibling's the same size as the older sibling. And so it's like, okay, that's not there anymore. Mm. And maybe they reach the same level of consciousness, or they're just as smart, and it's like, okay, now all the advantages the older sibling had, now that's evened out, let's say. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, it's a whole new game now.
It's time for a real fight.
Exactly. But it's hard to see that and know that, right? And that's what we all experience with our parents, right? We get to adolescence, and it's like, we're mad that our parents ever tried to control us or tell us what to do. And it's like, what do you think would have happened if they didn't through infancy, toddlerhood, pre-adolescence?
Still in adolescence. Then would be some things.
Yes.
The stakes just keep getting higher.
But yeah, it's dangerous territory because people can look at it from a mindset of, obviously you can say that a certain party is superior when they're not, when they're not older, when they're not, in a position of where they've just via force have assumed a dominant position. And it's like, hey, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
And it's very important to, try to discern those.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.